Okay, welcome. We are continuing our discussion of early modern philosophy, and more specifically, we're continuing our discussion of Locke with one of Locke's biggest and most lasting ideas. And this is Locke's theory of personal identity. So, we are going to be seeing what Locke is doing with his idea here. So, the plan for this video is we'll get clear on the question of what I'm going to call numerical identity. Identity can mean a lot of different things, and even the question, are you the same person that you once were? Well, that question is actually a little bit vague. It could mean a lot of different things. So we're going to get clear on exactly what Locke's question is. One thing that we need to see in order to understand Locke's theory correctly is to understand what Locke is telling us when he says that personal identity is a forensic concept. And once we have this forensic concept of personal identity on the board, we'll be able to contrast Locke's view with what we might call the substance view. And this is a view that has already been hanging around and somewhat implicit in some of the other philosophers we've looked at so far this term. So the sameness of substance view for personal identity seems to appear for both Descartes and Leibniz. Locke is going to give us some arguments that the substance view is not the correct view for answering questions of numerical identity. So, what is this question of numerical identity? Well, it's the question, how is X now the same as X then? So, we all agree, for instance, that this pair of sunglasses is one thing, and even if the factory made another pair, that would be a distinct thing. But we might say that these sunglasses are one and the same with themselves, right? We might then ask the question, well, I leave these sunglasses, in my bag or on my desk, and then the next day I come and I pick them up, and I assume that not only are these sunglasses identical to themselves in the moment, but that they continue to exist over time. So sometimes when we talk about numerical identity, we can even get more specific and talk about what we might call, that's a D, diachronic. Forgive my poor writing here. So we're talking about diachronic identity, right? So when we talk about numerical identity in the diachronic sense, we're talking about being one and the same thing over time. So chronic, you might think of as an in time. Dia means more than one. When we talk about synchronic identity, we just say like everything is one and the same with itself in the moment. When we're talking about diachronic identity, we're talking about not only being one and the same thing in the moment, but it's being one and the same thing over time. It's something that is itself, and it continues to exist as itself as time moves forward. So that's really the question that Locke got clear on. What is it for you to be you and for you to continue to exist over time? Right? So not only can we ask, what is it for something to be one and the same thing in a moment, but we can also talk about being one and the same thing over time. Now, we do need to get clear on how this question is distinct from qualitative identity, right? Because we might say that two things could be, at least empirically speaking, identical in their quality. So I could have two pieces of chalk in my hand, or I could have two jelly beans, and I could say that these two pieces of chalk or these two jelly beans have all the same apparent empirical qualities, right? So we can talk about qualitative identity. And we can also notice that we seem to assume that some things can continue to exist over time, but change in their qualities. So we might say, like, look, Socrates could exist over time, but when he has a sunburn, he is not in all of his qualities identical to how he was when it was in the dead of winter and he was looking very pale, right? So we might say qualitatively, Socrates, when he gets a sunburn, is different. But numerically speaking, if he remains the same guy, numerical identity persists even though qualitative identity does not. Sometimes we say things like, you've changed, right? You've changed, man, right? But when we make these claims, we're not usually saying that this person is literally a different individual than they were before. We might just say, that kind of statement is to make a claim about shifts in a person's values or habits or ways of acting in the world. So Locke is interested not really in this question of qualitative identity. It's kind of obvious that things can change qualitatively over time, especially people. People will change over time qualitatively. But what he's interested in is numerical identity, right? How is it that you can be yourself and remain one and the same thing, even though you're changing in all sorts of ways? You might have heard this scientific factoid. Some of my students who are medically adept tell me that it's not exactly true, but the scientific factoid says every 7 years, all the cells and all the particles and all the matter in your body are replaced. Now, apparently, this is not quite true of all of your nerves. So certain parts of your spinal cord are probably actually older than 7 years. But we say, look, even though all these parts of your body are being swapped out all the time, you are still yourself. And we might still admire you or blame you for things that you did more than 7 years ago when your body composition was quite different. All right. Now, when we start thinking about this question of numerical identity, we realize that in different contexts, we do things in different ways. Locke will even tell us that for a material object, it's no longer literally the same thing if one atom is taken away or a new one is added, right? So think about a glass of water. Well, if we went in and removed half of the hydrogen atoms from this glass of water, and we just had some hydrogen peroxide and then put new hydrogens in and turn that hydrogen peroxide back into water, well, we would be swapping out a bunch of the parts, right? And we would say that the new glass of water with swapped out hydrogens would be just a literally new thing. It is not one and the same glass of water than we were dealing with before. But we already made this remark about, say, your body, how its parts get swapped out. We might say, look, your body is one and the same thing as your body 7 years ago, even though the cells and the molecules are being swapped out, right? You shed off some, you replace some. Locke is going to say here that here we're dealing with a continuing of complex succeeding stages organized to produce distinctive stages of life. And in this way, the organization of your body towards that goal is going to be sufficient to say, look, even though this tree, it started out as a tiny little sapling and now it's this huge, wide, 100-foot tall oak tree, we would say that is one thing that is numerically the same with the sapling, even though it's changing over time. So now how are we going to deal with persons? Well, one thing that Locke is going to say is he wants to actually distinguish between the word man and the word person. So when Locke is using the word man, he's sort of thinking about the human being as a biological organism. So we might say, look, just as a tree is a complex organization towards this goal of life, we could talk about our bodies as complex organizations of materials towards the preservation of life. And in that way, look, you can be the same man, or I guess we could say human being to be gender neutral nowadays. You are the same human being if you have a living body that is persisting over time towards a common goal organized towards life. But Locke is going to say we can still have a different concept of person. So whereas man, or again, human being, is a biological concept, we can still reserve this term person for Locke to refer to not really your body or your biological status, but rather something about your psychology, right? So you would say that your psychology is more than just being a body directed towards life, but it's to have a self, to have thoughts. So we would think of person as more of a psychological concept than a biological concept. Here's what Locke says. He says, we must consider what person stands for. This, I think, is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and considers itself as itself. So this is a way in which we could say, like, look, your body, like just your arm doesn't consider itself as itself because that's your body and it's not your mind. We would also realize that things without thought are not persons. So even though an oak tree is a biological organism, it seems like the best scientific evidence we have does not treat it as a thinking thing with self-awareness and self-consciousness, right? Because not only does a person consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. So not only are you self-aware, but you are self-aware in a way that projects yourself future into the future and also backwards into the past. So you see yourself as a persistent being over time. That is, a being with diachronic numerical identity, right? So how do you do these things of having reason, reflection, considering yourself as existing over different times and places? Well, you do it via consciousness, which is inseparable from thinking. And Locke says that thinking is essential to it. So that you are a thinking being is the essence of your being a person, which is, in other words, a being with a self. So beings that are persons have rationality or intelligence, self-awareness, and perception of themselves existing over time. So now we've got a clearer question, right? Locke's question is, how is it that you are this kind of being with a self, and how does your self continue to exist over time, numerically speaking, right? So it's not that you don't change qualitatively, but you still will be one and the same thing in spite of those changes. Now, here's an interesting remark towards the back of the chapter. Locke notes that personhood is a forensic or a legal term. We could also say that thinking in terms of a forensic term for Locke means it's a term that's important for the way in which human beings hold one another accountable, right? So when we hold one another accountable, we are maybe praising a person for a good thing that they did, so we're admiring them. Or we can also talk about accountability in terms of, blaming a person for a bad thing that they did. Maybe saying that they even deserve a punishment. So if someone commits a murder, we say like, look, this is the person who committed that crime in the past. And because they committed that crime, it makes sense to mete out a certain punishment. Well, so Locke is going to say we need this concept of personhood and diachronic numerical identity because we need this concept for holding others responsible, right? So having the concept of a person can allow us to answer this question of accountability. Because if you're not the same person that you once were, then it wouldn't make sense to punish you for the thing that this other individual who was not the same person as you did it, right? Like, you shouldn't punish me for something my brother has done, right? And if you are not numerically identical with your previous selves, then it wouldn't make sense to punish your previous selves either. So this actually raises a bunch of interesting legal questions. So for instance, if you commit a crime in your sleep, or if you have amnesia about a crime that you've committed, or you commit a crime while sleepwalking and have no awareness of having committed it, does that entail that there's no accountability for the crimes that you commit? Now, Locke here is actually going to say, actually, yeah, if you were to commit a crime, but that crime had no bearing on, if it were a completely inaccessible experience to your other thoughts and experiences, then it would make no sense to punish a person for, say, murdering somebody while they were sleepwalking, or for having committed a crime and then this person has total amnesia and their brain is wiped empty. Locke is going to say it actually doesn't make sense to punish that person. Now, Locke does say in the courts, if a person says, oh, I may have committed that crime, but I have no recollection of having committed it, Locke is willing to point out that we typically don't actually allow this defense in courts because people lie about what they do and don't remember. So, for instance, Locke says that there's counterfeit, right? So there are people lying about their lack of recollection of things. You actually see this in court cases nowadays when people don't want to incriminate themselves. They simply say, I do not recall. Well, Locke says, because of that problem, we might hold an individual accountable for what they did with their body and what we can reasonably expect them to remember and be accountable for. But technically speaking, if a person really had no recollection of a crime they committed, it wouldn't really make sense to punish that person for it. So Locke is really thinking about, like, what is a good concept of the person that can be used for holding others responsible. Now, he does make one other remark. He says that, at the end of the day, that is, say, once you die and maybe you're in heaven and they're evaluating you, maybe I shouldn't say in heaven, but at St. Peter's Gate, he makes a remark something to the tune of, the secret of all hearts will be revealed and God will know whether you actually remember it. So he's going to say that people might not always be able to fully answer the question whether somebody should be held accountable for a crime, but perhaps at least God will know whether you actually do or don't recall having done something. And if you don't recall having done something, then Locke seems to think that even God would let you off the hook. So, in working out an answer, and I've already hinted at it, what is it that allows for diachronic, numerical, personal identity? So how do we answer this question? How is it that this person you're dealing with right now is the same person they were 10 years ago? And Locke's answer is going to be sameness of consciousness or continuity of consciousness. So to have a self is to be a conscious being. It's the first line of thought. And Locke is going to tell us that if the consciousness that constitutes your current self, your current person that is, if there is continuity between that person and the previous self, then that is enough to make the two selves, or at least the two looks at a self, actually numerically identical. So on Locke's view, memory is hugely important. Now we might think of ways in which things other than memory might constitute continuity, such as your thoughts happening in continuous succession. Locke is going to worry about this for a moment because he's going to say, look, it seems like your thoughts move in succession all day, but then you go to sleep, right? And when you go to sleep, it seems like you have a discontinuity in consciousness. Well, what then happens is these stretches of consciousness can then be tied together with memory, right? So even though I did become unconscious when I went to sleep last night, we might say Locke could say I'm still the same person I was yesterday because I remember some things that I did yesterday. So for instance, that I ate Chinese food for dinner, and that on that particular Sunday afternoon yesterday, I planted a tree in my front yard with my spouse. So we might say, look, memory is able to tie my experience today to the experiences that I had yesterday of spending a Sunday afternoon planting a tree in the front yard. So, Locke is going to tell us that personal identity can be placed in nothing but consciousness, which alone makes which we call the self, what we call the self, without involving great absurdities. So, oftentimes when you're reading early modern texts, it can actually be hard to identify the argument. Sometimes it feels like they're just laying out the view. To some extent, that can be how Locke's chapter on personal identity looks. He's just asserting the view. But it seems that on page 358, we at least have a hint at an argument. He's going to say, I've got this theory of what it is for you to be you, how your self can persist over time. And he's going to claim that if you take another view, if you adopt another theory, then you will be stuck asserting great absurdities. So he's going to say, my view has no absurdities, whereas other views have absurdities. So let's look at some other views and see if we can figure out why Locke thinks these views leave us with a result that is absurd. So you might recall that Descartes said, I am a thinking thing, and to be a thinking thing is ultimately to be a particular kind of substance that is a thinking substance, the mind, the cogito, the soul, and that is the thing that makes you you. Leibniz also made a similar claim. He said, look, you are a substance with an infinite number of modes. With an infinite number of true predicates of yourself. So Leibniz is going to say, what is it for you to be you? Well, it's to be a substance which then has this infinite number of properties that reflects your place in the universe. So, whereas Leibniz and Descartes say that it's spiritual substance that makes you you, there might be some other philosophers that say, look, it's material substance that makes you you. Well, we already saw some problems with the material substance view. It seems like we do have the same person over time, even though parts of their body change. Remember that it would still make sense to hold a person accountable for committing a murder, even if the material constitution of their body changes. Like we could imagine a person cutting their arm off, or removing their beard, or even just over time eating a bunch of food and having the molecules in that food replace the molecules currently constituting the body. So it would be an absurd view, Locke thinks, to claim that the material substance that makes up your body to be that which constitutes yourself. Right? Now, we get another answer. Descartes' going to say, yeah, it's not the material stuff that makes you up, that makes you you. It's your soul. It's the thing that thinks. It's your spiritual substance, not your material substance. But here's Locke's objection. Locke is going to say, having the same spiritual substance is going to be useless for personal identity if there's no memory of that past life. So he gives the example of somebody who he met, who claimed that he, this person that Locke met, had the soul of Socrates in him. So you can imagine somebody saying, yes, I have an old soul. My soul existed in this universe before I was born. And this person is going to further claim that that soul that is doing the thinking and moving in my body right now was once the soul that thought and moved in the body of Socrates way back when. Well, Locke thinks that this isn't really going to work if this person doesn't actually remember having been Socrates. So for instance, if this person is saying, look, I have the soul of Socrates in me, but yeah, I don't actually remember, giving the speech which was immortalized in Apology, or I don't remember the Peloponnesian War, or I don't remember teaching Plato, right? Well, you could conceivably have this soul substance of Socrates in you. It might be recycled throughout the universe. But if you don't remember anything of that past life, then this guy who thinks that he has a bit of Socrates' soul in him is not the same person as Socrates. Locke even says, imagine substance swapping in sleep. So I went about my day yesterday, planted a tree, ate some Chinese food, went to bed, and then I got up this morning and I made my coffee and I got on with my day. Now, imagine that God came and swapped out my soul substance in my sleep, right? My body's laying there in bed. I'm not conscious at the moment. And God goes in and removes the substance that is my soul, assuming that we have these things called soul. Locke is willing to grant this assumption for the sake of argument. He says you could have your soul substance removed from you and have another soul transplanted in. Right? So maybe I have the soul of Socrates in me right now, but before I had the soul of, Genghis Khan in my body. Well, what God does is he simply pulls out that one substance, swaps in the other one, and I wake up in the morning. I have enough memory stored in my brain and my habits and my body that today feels like yesterday. I don't feel any different. I still remember having planted a tree yesterday. But that's going to show for Locke that you could have persistence of personal identity even when you swap out substance. So this is going to raise trouble for Descartes and Leibniz if they're going to claim that sameness of substance is what explains persistence of the self. Locke is going to say the substrate, the stuff that our memories and our actions are explained by, the thinking thing, Locke is going to say that's much less important than memory. He also says we could imagine certain science fiction or just fiction stories of having one man, right? One biological human being with two personalities. So for instance, we could imagine the Jekyll and Hyde story. If you don't know the Jekyll and Hyde story, it's basically the idea that, so Dr. Jekyll is a nice, peaceful man, but because of some chemical infection or something, he then becomes an evil monster at night. And in fact, Dr. Jekyll is trying to figure out who Mr. Hyde is, along with everybody else in London, not realizing all the while that it's his body that's waking up at night and committing horrible crimes and being a terror, right? Now, this would be a story, Locke is going to say, where you have the same man, the biological body, but there are two different persons. So he's going to say there is complete discontinuity between the consciousness of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in this story, right? And in this way, because there's no overlap of those consciousnesses, that means they are not the same person. It wouldn't make sense to hold Dr. Jekyll for what Mr. Hyde did. But we could imagine some other science fiction. You all know these like Prince Frog kind of stories, right? So in these sorts of fairy tales, a frog is saying to the princess, help me, I used to be a prince. If you just give me a kiss, then I'll turn back into a prince. I'll have my soul moved into the right body." Well, that would be the kind of story where we would say that frog is the same person as the individual, the self that the prince was, right? So the frog and the prince would be the same person because there are meaningful psychological connections between the person in the prince state, living a princely life, living in a human body. If all those memories and experiences were then continuously transplanted into a frog, we would say, look, even though body changes entirely, the substance that allows you to live and breathe and think, you're not the same person, right? And in fact, because personhood doesn't depend on the body, you could, for instance, hold that frog responsible for something that it did while it was in the state of being a prince. Here's a more modern example. You might know TV shows like Star Trek, but you can think of any science fiction that involves a teletransporter, right? So with a teletransporter, we might imagine two boxes, right? And this box is on Earth, and this box is on Mars, right? You'd say, it's just going to take far too long to get to Mars. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you into the earthly teletransporter. That's you. And here's what happens. You press the button on the teletransporter. And when you press the button, your body is scanned. All the particles are mapped out. And then, through the technology of wireless technology, at the speed of light, information about the structure of your body is sent to Mars. And, some magic happens. They have like maybe a magical fine-grained laser printer that, puts a carbon exactly where there should be a carbon and an oxygen exactly where there should be an oxygen. And on the other side, a perfect replica of you comes out. And not only does it have the exact same body, like if there's a scar on your finger in the original teletransporter, what is created in the teletransporter will also have the same little scar on its finger, and so on and so forth. It makes a perfect replica of your brain. So all the information that went into your brain on Earth is in the brain of the duplicate. And as such, if you ask the duplicate on Mars, like, where is your copy of such and such a book, right? We might be able to realize that the Mars duplicate of you, or we might say yourself on Mars, right? but we might say that the duplicate is able to answer all memory-based questions just as well. It seems like with these sorts of science fiction examples, Locke is going to say, look, yeah, none of your material parts persist, but so long as there is a continuity of your consciousness in this new being that has been produced on Mars, that being is you. So, the question we might ask here is, do you survive teletransportation? And if you say yes, then you are on board with Locke's view. We avoid the absurdities when we say, for instance, that as long as you've got the same consciousness, which memory can make continuous, then that's still you. Now, some others have claimed that it is a great absurdity to claim that it's you that comes out of the teletransporter on Mars. So there are some people who have the philosophical intuition that a teletransporter is not a fast way to travel. It's what they say is a fancy way of removing yourself from existence and creating a qualitatively identical but numerically non-identical copy of yourself. So that view on the teletransporter is going to say, look, what it is for you to be you, if you think that you're taking yourself out of existence by teletransporting, you're making a numerically non-identical version of yourself, then you're rejecting Locke's theory. And you might even say that Locke's theory involves a great absurdity. Now, here's one thing that we might do to stand up for Locke against this view that using the teletransporter is just a fancy way of taking yourself out of existence. Ask yourself this. Imagine that the bad guy, think about your least favorite person, let's say, to be neutral, let's think about the Joker from Batman. And the Joker goes into the teletransporter on Earth, goes out of existence, the light beams shoot over to Mars, and this being comes out of the other side. And as far as you can tell, by asking all the questions you can ask it, this new being that's come out of the teletransporter still remembers committing crimes against the people of Gotham City. And it still wants to watch the world burn, just as the earthly Joker did. You might say that is a perfectly reasonable set of evidence to hold this teletransported Joker personally accountable. So in this way, we say, look, ultimately, if the soul carrying consciousness with it moves into a new body, but really it's the consciousness that's doing the work, not the soul, right? If the consciousness stays continuous and the consciousness is moved, so if you moved the soul of a prince into a cobbler, that's why we had a painting of a cobbler for the title slide. If we move the soul of a prince into it, we would treat that individual as the same person as the prince. And we would hold that individual as accountable for what the prince did, but not necessarily what the cobbler did. So, at this point, I'll leave it to you to reflect. Does the continuity of consciousness view save us from great absurdities, as opposed to other possible views of personal identity, which might say that what it is for you to be the person you are is your body or your soul, or maybe something else? I'll leave that for you to reflect on. So just to recap, our question about numerical identity of persons is to be one and the same as a previous thinking being. This word of diachronic identity is this question of what it is to exist not just in the moment, but in the future and also in the past. And in order to answer this question, Locke is going to favor what we can call a continuity of consciousness view. And according to Locke, if you try to ground personal identity not in consciousness, but in sameness of substance, your view is going to run into absurdities, whereas Locke thinks that his view does not. So I will stop there, and I will leave it to you to reflect on whether Locke has saved us from absurdity or not. And we will pick up the discussion soon. Thanks very much.